Good morning. My name is Marcus Gehring. Thank you very much to the organizers of the SMART conference for including my presentation in their conference program. The topic of sustainable development in international economic law has been very dear to my research agenda for a very long time. And what I'm going to present today is based on a legal research project which I conducted with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, the CISDL, funded by the UN Environment Programme, UNEP. In this project, we analyzed the existing public international law that is relevant to the different SDGs, and I co-authored one of the briefs on SDG12. So I'd like to share my views on SDG12 and international economic law, while at the same time recognizing that Freedom Kai Phillips, who is my co-author for the paper, has been intimately involved in this research. And I know that two of his CG colleagues are in the room with you today, so ask them about Freedom and his research agenda and his work. Now, sustainable development and international trade in particular has had a long history. Ever since the negotiation of the World Trade Organization and the inclusion of sustainable development as a last-minute addition to the preamble of the World Trade Organization agreement, we've had discussions on how these two areas of law actually intersect. Well, in many ways, the Sustainable Development Goals, even though they just constitute a political document, a soft law instrument, much like the Rio Declaration, have the potential to significantly influence our thinking in the field. Ever since Dan Asti wrote his book Greening the GATT, there has been serious legal scholarship and discussion on the interaction of sustainable development and international trade, and some of my own publications, I hope, have contributed to that debate. Now, in this brief presentation, I will briefly lay out what is SDG 12 on consumption, how does it interact with existing trade law. There is also a dimension to look at international investment law, but for the purpose of this presentation, I will really focus on international trade law. And interestingly, the thesis that I'm presenting to you today is that world trade law has significantly evolved over the last 25 years since its inception, especially dispute settlement decisions such as China rare earth or Brazil retreaded tires have moved our understanding on how to sustainably manage our resources, how to develop a circular economy, how to really establish sustainable consumption and natural resource management patterns. This whole research also is based on the work that I've done with CISDL colleagues on sustainable development in world trade law. Now, first of all, what is SDG 12? Those of you who are not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, I strongly recommend to look at some of the founding documents, some of the travaux préparatoires for the SDGs, which were adopted by the General Assembly a year before last. This is one of the most significant legal developments of our time. It came only months before the Paris Agreement and really provided one of the stepping stones, what in retrospect has to be seen as one of the high watermarks in sustainable development, culminating in December of 2015 with the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, SDG 12 is relatively straightforward. It's the Sustainable Development Goal on sustainable consumption and production to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. It has several paragraphs, including 3 implementation paragraphs, but 8 operational paragraphs, and it covers a 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption. It looks at sustainable management of natural resources. It tries to halve global food wastes. It calls for environmental sound management of chemicals. It aims to reduce waste generation in all its facets, and it encourages companies to report on their progress and to ensure sustainable procurement practices. All of you can immediately see how this easily relates to the law of the World Trade Organization. Sustainable consumption and production can be defined in the following way: the use of goods and services that respond to basic needs and bring a better quality of life while minimizing the use of natural resources, toxic materials, and emissions of waste and pollutants over a life cycle, so as not to jeopardize the need of future generations. The inclusion of sustainable consumption and production as a Sustainable Development Goal 12 builds on early recognition of the importance of sustainable use of natural resources in the Stockholm Declaration, and then evolving sustainable development patterns and recognition of those patterns, especially in the Rio Declaration and in Agenda 21. Chapter 4 of Agenda 21 singled out sustainable consumption and production as an important policy priority. It was then later developed by the UN Commission on Sustainable Development. It was picked up in the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation and figured very prominently in the Future We Want. It also is embodied in the ILA's New Delhi Principles on the Law of Sustainable Development, in that one of the principles tries to ensure the sustainable use of natural resources. International law and policy instruments play a key role in influencing consumption and production patterns and are essential to the achievement of SDG 12. Without an international legal framework, we could not achieve these goals, or it would be very, very difficult for a single state to achieve these goals. To foster or frustrate all targets under SDG 12, a 10-year framework of program was established. And it calls for the implementation of this program in a manner in which global trade agreements are interpreted and engaged. It calls for an open, non-discriminatory and transparent trade mechanism, which has also been earlier identified as an important factor in Agenda 21. Now, as I reported, environmental concerns have had a long and somewhat checkered history in the WTO. They're mostly covered under the Agreement on Trade in Goods, i.e. the GATT, and are to a certain extent covered by Article 20. There are also elements that need to be observed in the TBT and the SPS agreement, and of course issues such as intellectual property rights, and maybe even the new agreement of government procurement can have an important impact on this area. I should underline that recent developments in the WTO agreement on government procurement provide for the recognition of environmental criteria in government procurement, which has been hailed as a major step of development. Of course, WTO law does not exist in clinical isolation and therefore interacts with other important parts of public international law, such as the Basel Convention on transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. And for trade lawyers in the room, I'd just like to highlight the carve-out that the Basel Convention has out of NAFTA, even though the United States is not a party to the Basel Convention. There are various ways in which chemicals are regulated in international law. For our purposes, it suffices to highlight the Rotterdam Convention, the POPs Convention, the Stockholm Convention, and the Minamata Convention on mercury, which tries to eliminate mercury from mining over placing on the market to consumption and later recycling. So the entire product cycle of this very dangerous heavy metal has been regulated by the Minamata Convention. And there are some questions as to how these public international law instruments interact with WTO law. In my view, it is less problematic if you have a public international law agreement, a treaty, because at least the appellate body in the implementation phase of the shrimp turtle dispute against the United States has recognized that any treaty regime that is open to all WTO members, at least in theory, could serve as a non-discriminatory way under the chapeau of Article 20 in which to regulate any area that has a direct impact on trade and goods. Of course, if the Doha development agenda had been successful, then we would probably have a declaration on trade and environment which covers trade measures by environmental agreements. I should also highlight that corporate social responsibility is becoming increasingly important for consumption and production patterns, especially companies that are concerned about their supply chain, and their sustainable development law interacts very directly with human rights. The new discussion on human rights in business, which you're going to discuss during these 2 days, is of high relevance also to SDG12, because in many ways a production and consumption scheme is only sustainable if it recognizes and realizes the fundamental rights of the people involved in the broader supply chain. Access to relevant information as called for by SDG paragraph 8, SDG 12 paragraph 8 is increasingly important, and new legal standards such as the CSR directive in the European Union are important in this